Our interview today is with Kenneth Ludmerer, MD. Dr. Ludmerer is the Mabel Dorn Reader Professor of the History of Medicine at Washington University and the author of a number of noted books on the history of medicine. He's a long-term member and master of the American College of Physicians and a strong supporter for its programs. Ken has also, for much of my career, been down the hall from me in terms of our joint offices, and I had the privilege of reading a couple of his books in draft form before they were published. So, Ken, where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born and raised in Long Beach, California.
I think your dad was a physician, is that not right?
That's correct. My father was an ophthalmologist. My mother, a concert pianist. My father's career illustrated the trajectory in ophthalmology. At the time he did his training, everything was eye, ear, nose, and throat. There were no special programs in ophthalmology. So he did an outstanding residency at the Chicago Eye and Ear in eye, ear, nose, and throat. He later did additional post-residency coursework and program work in ophthalmology. When he went into practice in Long Beach, California, remember his shingle said, Sal Ludmerer, MD, practice limited to the eye. And it was quite unusual at that time. He was among the very first to limit his practice to the eye. And I might also say that his career illustrated the trajectory of ophthalmology. He entered practice as one of the most specialized specialists of his day. He was always in private practice, but academically oriented. He was asked to be the first chair of ophthalmology at what is now the University of California, Irvine School of Medicine. In 1962, the California College of Medicine, the California College, I'm twisting my words. So in 1962, the Los Angeles College of Osteopathy was converted into a private medical school called the California College of Medicine, located in Los Angeles. It used LA County Hospital for most of its clinical work. And he was asked to be the chair of ophthalmology there, put together the residency program and so forth, which he did. In 1968, University of California took over the school, built a new campus on Irvine, and when that was completed, moved to Irvine, California, where it remains as the University of California, Irvine School of Medicine. They asked him if he would stay on as chair when they began the new Irvine School, but he wasn't really a research man, and he knew a school of that stature needed a full-time research man. So he continued as a clinical professor of ophthalmology until he retired. And he began as what some might perceive as a narrow specialist in ophthalmology. By the time he finished his career, ophthalmology itself had undergone such subspecialization, he felt only as if he were a general practitioner within ophthalmology. So it was an interesting, I think, career trajectory.
I think people listening to this, many may not be aware of that. As you know, I grew up in rural Nebraska, and the nearest eye physician was 100 miles away. And it was it was a group, just as you said, eye, ear, nose, and throat. And so it's part of the evolution. Do you have siblings? Do you have brothers and sisters?
I'm sorry?
Do you have brothers or sisters?
I have two brothers. The middle brother, Rick, lives in Santa Rosa, California. He's a lawyer, and he was the vice president of the Sonoma campus of the California State University. My youngest brother, Steve, lives in the Philadelphia area. He began life to be a musician. he is a world-class violist, and he trained in Bern, Switzerland. He trained, he studied and lived with William Primrose in Banff, Canada. To those who are not familiar with the musical history, Primrose was to viola in the 20th century what Heifetz was to violin. And my brother became close friends with Primrose, and they remained in touch throughout the rest of Primrose's life. The very last moment, for various reasons, my brother decided to switch careers, got a PhD in molecular biology from MIT, did postdocs at MIT and Stanford, became a senior scientist at Merck, where he is, has been extremely productive. And he was head of the Merck program that developed their drug Zepatier, the hepatitis C drug, which was a major accomplishment in the pharmaceutical industry.
So, you know, it sounds like there were two major influences, medicine on your father's side, music on your mother's. Do you have musical interests? Are you a musician?
I'm in between. I'm not a musician myself. I had my compulsory piano lessons. My mother was very disappointed when I forced her to let me stop. She said I had talent. I didn't believe it because I compared myself to her, and she could hear something once and play it by ear and had abilities that I knew that I didn't have. But I've remained interested in music. I've been a supporter of the St. Louis Symphony as long as I've been here in St. Louis. And as I think you know, Dan, I'm on the board of the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra now and have been contributing to and working for that organization.
So, you know, so many people are reluctant to leave California. How did you happen to decide to go to Harvard rather than Stanford?
When I was a high school sophomore, there was a senior who was my hero, and he went to Harvard. That put Harvard in my mind. And,
I see. So I know that you know that you published your first book when you were early in medical school. Had you begun that while you were an undergraduate?
Well, actually, that's precisely what did happen. I became very interested in the history of medicine, the history of science as a college undergraduate. And there was a major for people like me. It was called History and Science. It was very popular among the pre-meds at that time because you got as much science coursework as most people with science majors did, but you had much more history and humanities in your program. It was administered by the History of Science department, and our senior theses were in the history of science. And I wrote a senior thesis on the eugenics movement, got very much into that project. I received the department's prize for best thesis, et cetera, those sorts of things, and thought nothing more of it. But by coincidence, I went to medical school at Johns Hopkins, which has, as you know, a strong tradition in the history of medicine, and that influence and contact gave me the idea of picking up the project. So my first book was written while I was in medical school. It was an outgrowth of my college senior thesis. With one book done, it was in my blood to do others, which is how I embarked on the unique career path I've had of being a physician historian, physician medical educator.
So obviously there are many different ways to get to where you are. What was your thought process in deciding to go to medical school as opposed to getting a straight PhD in history and pursuing your career that way?
Well, that's when I knew I really wanted to be a doctor. I had always thought I wanted to be a doctor and said I wanted to be a doctor, but as much because that was expected of me than any real driving passion. But when I got to college, I compared it with alternative career paths, a PhD in biology, a PhD in molecular biology, a PhD in either history or the history of science. And I recognized that the medical component of it was the core of who I am and what I wanted to do. And I could bring these other tools into it, either the science or the social analysis, if I chose to do so. But that's when my decision to become a doctor became firm in college, comparing it with these other fields.
Was your decision to go to Hopkins colored by their strength in the history of medicine, or was it?
No, not at all. It was a fortunate coincidence for me as the decision to go to Harvard as opposed to other good schools, because at both Harvard and Johns Hopkins, there was very much a spirit of service, not only of learning and mastering your field or getting a good job, but making the world and society better in some fashion. And that ethic strongly influenced me in college, and it was equally present, if not more so, at the Johns Hopkins Medical School, where there is a spirit that not only do we want to practice the best medicine, we want to make medicine and to make medicine better for tomorrow. And that ethic had a huge impact on me and has influenced everything I've done. So I feel very fortunate. I didn't go to either Harvard or Johns Hopkins for those reasons, but once I was there, I profited from those aspects of the experience.
Once you were at Hopkins, what decision process or what influenced you to go into internal medicine?
I liked the scientific foundation of internal medicine. I liked dealing with the whole patient, and those were the primary attractions of it. I really enjoyed all my rotations. I learned a lot and enjoyed surgery, though I didn't have the hand coordination to really be a great surgeon, in my opinion. And I wanted to be at the top of, have a chance to be at the top of whatever field I went into. I really enjoyed psychiatry. I got recruited by them, but it was just not based on a firm enough scientific foundation. And the therapies were not as satisfying as in some other fields. So it came down to a choice between medicine and pediatrics for me, which is not an uncommon place for people at that point in their lives and careers to be. I had already written my book. My book came out during my third year of medical school. And I couldn't say it in these words at the time, but I had a sense that medicine had a broader umbrella. So for a person with unusual career interests such as I had, that might be a more productive place to be, and there might be greater opportunities to do something not in the conventional track. And those were the reasons I ultimately chose medicine.
What years were you in medical school? What year did you enter and graduate?
I entered in the fall of 1968. I graduated in 1973. I spent the 1970-71 year as a graduate student in the program in the history of medicine, and that's when I wrote my book.
You were in school during the passage of Title IX and the beginning of the transition that would see more women entering medicine. Of course, Hopkins had been admitting women to medical school for many years as part of its agreement, I think, with the women's organization that helped fund the school. How many women were in your class?
There were roughly 6 women, as I remember, in my entering class, which had been the average since the school had been created. Hopkins never got into the co-ed business in any significant way, despite the arrangement that you're referring to. In the 1880s, the Johns Hopkins Medical School and Hospital are being created and put together. Much of the assets of the Johns Hopkins Medical School were tied into stock at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which tanked during that decade and stopped paying dividends. So they had real financial problems for a period. A woman by the name of Mary Garrett came to the rescue and offered the school $500,000, which is what it needed to complete its task to open on their ideal standards without compromising. But she said the condition of this money is that you be open to women. William Welch was the dean. He was also a misogynist. He said, okay, we'll do it. And they were literally co-ed, but for a number of years, that meant one woman a year. So Mary Garrett was very annoyed because the spirit of her gift was not really being honored. And it grew from there, but 5 or 6% was pretty standard. That's what my class had. It was 2 years later that women entered Johns Hopkins in much larger numbers. The group beginning in the fall of 1970 had about 20% or so women. And
you were ahead of us. You were ahead of us then. At Duke in 1970, there were 8 women in my class of 108. But by the time I graduated in 1974, the incoming class, I think, had 44% women. So it was a watershed moment in education in general. So can you tell me a little bit about what your medical school experience was like, both in the preclinical and the clinical years, how you spent your time and what you did?
The preclinical years were typical of the time. We had labs, we had lectures, a lot of book learning. We all were pretty serious about what we did. Even when we let off steam, it was a controlled letting off of steam. Everyone had a mission. There was good camaraderie in the class. Clinical work was traditional clinical work, very similar to what we do today. When you're on the wards, part of a team, you've got interns. Depending on the rotation, you might have 1 intern. I think at Hopkins, we usually had 2 interns and 2 residents per team, and an attending physician, and you worked up patients, you presented them. And, this was supplemented with conferences and rounds. And so there's active teaching, but you felt that formal teaching was a supplement to actually being there in the care of the patients, and direct conversation about a particular patient that you might have with the resident or the family or the attending physician. We worked hard, but we worked differently. There was scut work then, as there always has been and remains today. The scut work was of a different sort. It was drawing a lot of blood, so starting IVs, arterial blood gases, labeling, transporting things to wherever they needed to be transported to, those sorts of things, which we gladly did for our own patients. But it seemed much more of an imposition when we were asked to do things of that sort for patients who weren't ours. Today, hospitals have become much better relieving the physical work dimension of the experience, but we have our own scut work today with electronic records and the things that are involved with that. We also had fewer patients who were there for longer periods of time, and this is profoundly important. We could honor in action, not just word, the core principle in medicine being thorough and attentive to detail. So we were very thorough with all of our patients. Everyone got a complete examination. I remember when I was doing my Osler clinical clerkship as the 3rd-year student, there was an intern who was the hero of the service for a few days. He had admitted a woman for entirely different reasons, but as part of his admitting examination, he did a pelvic exam and detected a mass that was early, small, and treatable. He saved her life by his thoroughness, and he was quite the man for a period of time. And we would round twice a day on our patients and explain every abnormality. So even the tiniest lab abnormality, we wouldn't necessarily work it up, but we would discuss it, make sure we understood, A, is this significant or not? And B, why it's there. We'd only work it up if it was significant and there were a big question, but we would the goal was to understand everything about our patients, and this included knowing our patients as people and their families, not just the physical and laboratory aspects of who they were. So it was, and that remains the ideal of medicine. As you know, it's harder to do that today because of the changes in healthcare delivery, and that was the impetus for my book, Time to Heal. The time necessary to do the job right is being squeezed out of the system. But it was hard work, but it was gratifying work. There was meaning in work, which is something that we may not have as much of today as we did in the past.
Did you have wards on your labs in the OSLR service? Labs on your wards, rather, in the OSLR service? Did, clinical labs?
Yeah. By the time I was both on the OSLR service as well as here at Barnes, the answer is yes, we did. But we were doing less than even a few years before. We didn't have to routinely do gram stains and acid-fast stains and sputum. We could get the stains done. We did lots of urinalyses. We did lots of hematocrits. Those were the two major ones. We could usually send off the blood and get a CBC. So I learned how to do manual white counts as a student, but in practice, did not have to do that. I frequently would spin a blood sample down to get on hematocrit urinalyses. Those were the two biggest ones. When we did LPs, we'd look at the fluid ourselves, in addition to sending it off for lab studies. And the same thing if we did Thors and TCs, we'd look at it under the microscope as well as send it off for the various studies.
You talked about blowing off steam. Was one of the outlets the Pathotomy Club?
Well, they had a great play. Yeah, the answer is yes.
I think it got into trouble in later years when they made fun of one of the faculty members, and I believe it's been disbanded since. How else was your social life? What kinds of things did you do for entertainment and socialization and so on while you were in school in Baltimore?
It was largely class-related, school-related, hospital-related. I'd say that we would regularly get together. The classmates would regularly get together as friends when we could. In terms of dating, we'd largely meet people from around the hospital or the medical school, whether they be nurses or graduate students or whoever they might be. But it tended to be very hospital and work-related focused. We didn't get together with someone because of work. It was social, but our friends were people we met through the process of being students.
Sure. So moving on to graduate education, how did you happen to choose to come to Barnes?
I had an advisor named Phil Tumblety, who was
Sure.
a legend at that time. You remember him. And he was very charismatic as well as a brilliant clinician and inspiring teacher. And I remember meeting with him one day, and I said, Dr. Tumblety, I'm thinking of internal medicine. He, great, in his bombastic way. And I said, well, what do you consider the top programs in medicine? And I remember he said that there are 4 programs in medicine right now that I consider to be hot. And the way he said it, his reputation with us, immediately I'm tuned into what he's saying. And Barnes, Carl Moore was chair at that time, was one of the 4, and I started looking into it. And that's how it worked out.
So I think it was a fateful decision, but unusual, not unusual, but quite a change in environment for somebody who'd spent their entire life at that point on either coast. Was St. Louis a culture shock for you?
Not at all. It was important to me to be in a city which had a major teaching hospital and all of the opportunities that a large city provided, whether it was St. Louis or Chicago in the Midwest or Baltimore, or Boston in the East, that didn't matter to me at all. And in fact, there are I didn't know it at the time, but I had subsequently learned this to be true, that there are major similarities both between Johns Hopkins and WashU as medical schools and between the city of Baltimore and the city of St. Louis. So it really wasn't much of a transition at all.
Yeah, I would agree with both those things. Of course, the former, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that Welch was a consultant for rebuilding the medical school. Yeah. So I don't know, did Dr. Tumulty happen to mention to you that he'd spent a few years in St. Louis?
Yes, we knew that. In fact, as I recall, he arrived at Hopkins from St. Louis, having been the chair of medicine at St. Louis University. That's my recollection.
That's correct. He, I think he came from Baltimore to St. Louis to be chair, and then decamped a few years later when his expectations weren't met. So he went back to Baltimore. So tell me a little bit about your house staff training. So you probably interviewed perhaps under Moore, but arrived to find Kipnis in charge. Was that how it happened?
Yes, that's exactly correct. When I arrived as an intern, Dave Kipnis was chair. He's passed now, Alan Permit. He wouldn't have remembered, but he interviewed me during my day here. It's hard to remember who you've interviewed, but when you've been interviewed, you can remember who that person was. So I was interviewed by Alan Permit, and when I arrived, Dave Kipnis was chair of medicine.
So maybe tell me a little bit about your house staff training, and then I'm going to ask you a few things about your relationship to Dr. Kipnis. What was it like to be a house officer, an intern, a resident, and a chief resident at Barnes? Just a few paragraphs, perhaps.
Well, for me, it was an extraordinary experience, and I say that without forgetting the episodes of stress and sleep deprivation and everything else and hard work that occurred. We had longer hours than we do today. The number of hours would depend on what rotation a person happened to be on. So some of our rotations, for example, the coronary care unit, some rotations were every other night. So that would be well over 100 hours a week, because you'd be there, start at 8 a.m. and then you'd work the next day till 12 or 1 or whenever you finished rounding, and then you start again at 8 a.m. the next day. And then some of our rotations were every third night, and some of our rotations were every fourth night. But if you average it out, even in every fourth night, that still comes to more than 80 hours a week in the hospital. That did not necessarily mean you were awake the whole time. I mean, if you were on call, the number of admissions was much fewer then than it is today. As an intern and resident, I had no more than 4 admissions on any given on-call, long on-call experience. So that meant there was on average greater that there were opportunities to get some sleep at night. Not that you necessarily feel you were rested the next day, but to be on call did not mean you were up all night. On a bad night, from a sleep standpoint, it could mean that, but that was the exception rather than the rule. The rule is probably to get a few hours of sleep. There was meaning in the work. And this is something that I talk a lot about in my most recent book, Let Me Heal, on the residency system, which I think received this. I received the John C. Guinup Award for Distinguished Service to Graduate Medical Education from the ACGME for that work and my service in the board of the ACGME. And that influenced and became the foundation of the current common program requirements. And a key feature of that is the whole issue of meaning in work and deriving joy and fulfillment in work. And the reason that's there is because I have seen that in myself and in my contemporaries, that even though you're working hard, there is a sense of purpose and mission, that you're getting a return on an educational and personal return on the hard work that you're doing. You're not doing it in a vacuum. As a resident, I knew not only Dave Kipnis, but every division chief and many of the faculty in each of the divisions. And I knew that they knew me and took an interest in me. That itself is motivating and inspiring beyond anything we talk about today. You know, we talk about mindfulness or yoga or whatever it may happen to be. There is nothing, in my view, that beats walking through the hall, running into Dave Kipnis who said, I heard you were on call last night and had a difficult patient. You did a great job. Nothing can inspire, in my view, a resident more than something like that. And that was a regular occurrence when I went through, and I suspect when you went through as well. So it didn't necessarily alleviate stress or hard work, but it gave purpose and meaning to it. And you felt you were getting a return. So the issue of burnout, which did exist then, it's not a new issue, but I think it was much less than it is today because of these psychic and personal returns that a person is getting from work. Both as a student and as an intern, your experience depended very much on who your resident happened to be. And at both Hopkins and WashU, I can think very fondly of some wonderful residents that I had. Some from my Hopkins days are personal friends now that I'm in regular communication with and vacation with in one particular case. And most of my residents during my internship year at Barnes were good and supportive, but there was one in particular who was a real jerk. And Jeff Gordon had him as a resident on a different rotation, felt exactly the same way about him. He'd do everything he could to humiliate you and give you things to do, but not help with it. And he'd always have words of criticism, but no words of praise, you know, that type of thing. So, but fortunately, there were few like that particular resident. Most of the residents were good people who were uplifting in terms of how they dealt with their interns or students.
How many interns were in your class? Do you recall?
Roughly 30.
So you came after the merger between the private and the ward service, is that correct? Okay.
Correct. When you look at those pictures in the hall, you've got two sets of pictures for so many years, and the house staff is smaller. But the merger between the private and ward medical service, which was an official merger, occurred a couple of years before I arrived.
Yeah.
So by the time I was here, it was one service, and we took rotations on what we then called blue, which was the private area, what we then called red, which was the ward service, as well as emergency room and VA and other places. But that merger had occurred. The house staff, though large, was smaller than it is today because this precedes the merger between Barnes and Jewish Hospital in the 1990s.
Right. So I think the one at Barnes occurred in 1971 or thereabouts.
Yes.
Had the Osler and Marburg services merged by the time you left Hopkins? Residencies? They had two separate residencies.
Yeah, they were merging around the time. I don't remember if they had merged or if they were getting ready to merge. But many of the great teaching hospitals, Mass General among them, Hopkins, Barnes Hospital, had two distinct services, the private service and the ward service.
Yes.
It was a separate application.
Yes.
It was always the ward service that was the prestigious service because you dealt with the full-time faculty and you had more autonomy and responsibility caring for patients, more competitive to get into. And all of them around 1971 combined from two into one service, and that was because of Medicare regulations and rules for payment.
Right. So you said something about morale and knowing the faculty and so on. I think Dave Kipnis told me one time that when he took over the department in 1972, he had fewer than 50 full-time faculty between Barnes and Jewish, right? That the total number of full-time Washington University faculty in the Department of Medicine was fewer than 50. And of course, now it's, I think, approaching 500. And of course, as we've discussed, the residency is much larger. Do you have thoughts about, what that means for medical training and relationships and career development and so on?
I have concerns. The question is finding the right balance between size and opportunity. Certainly the advances both in the science of medicine and the practice of medicine require larger faculties than we had before. That is a good thing, and it's needed and necessary. But the question is, how big is enough? When does size get in the way of your primary mission? And that's a question that policymakers and medical administrators and department chairs and deans and so forth don't like to ask, because much of the growth of that in size that we've had is 100% for the private practice of medicine, which departs from the university mission of education, research, providing the best clinical care. The medical school and teaching hospital were created to support our system of clinical practice, not to be the system of clinical practice. And that's a critical difference. So when you get too far into private practice for its own sake, Johns Hopkins built during that period some outpatient facilities that specifically prohibited residents and students from participating. It's good from a business standpoint, perhaps, generates revenue, but it does change the view of, divert the view from your main mission of education and research and the best clinical care. You become another factory for clinical care. And with faculty that large, it's harder to know people. The type of relationships that a student or resident might have with a distinguished faculty member are still possible today. They still occur today, but not with the regularity that they did. Teaching gets delegated from the most experienced to the least experienced, particularly in our area, internal medicine. So I think there's some drawbacks. And I'm not suggesting we go back to the days of Dave Kipnis, but I am suggesting, as I have in my work, as you know, that we would be better served if we asked the question of what is the right size. It's much larger than you and I knew when we were coming along, but can growth get in the way of doing good work? And it's a thorny question, and it's an uncomfortable question, but in my opinion, it needs to be asked.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to ask at leadership levels because the money is so important, right? And with virtually every medical school with a practice plan having a substantial dean's tax, I think it's very difficult for deans to be objective about the questions.
Yes, but definitely money.
So what was your chief residency like as compared to chief residencies today?
When I was chief resident?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That was perhaps the greatest single year that I had. I did it after my fellowship, which was common at the time. Typically, there were a couple of years, 2 or 3 years between the chief resident who had not only completed a residency, but had done some sort of research training, subspecialty fellowship or something. So the chief resident was a bit more experienced than someone who immediately, who was coming into the position immediately from the 3rd year of residency. So we were more senior. There were two of us. Today at WashU, we have what, five or six. We reported directly to Dave Kipnis. There's no one in between. We had a residency program director, a wonderful man, a physician by the name of Dick Ock, who's still around, and he's returned to St. Louis. But his function was purely that of selecting the next group of interns. He was not involved with running the program as you did when you were a residency program director, and became the nature throughout the country. So as chief residents, we reported directly to Dave Kipnis. We spent 6 months as chief resident of red, 6 months as chief resident of blue. I did my first 6 months in red. I did a trade. We were responsible for CPCs and for the emergency room. My co-chief resident, my good friend John Daniels, and I'm pleased, as an aside, pleased to say that there's now a John Daniels Distinguished Professorship here at WashU. He was happy to do the CPCs, and I had no interest in doing the CPCs, but I was excited about the emergency room. So I was the attending physician in the emergency room all year long. We were on the first floor of Wool Hospital, which is now the dialysis area. We had 2 beds up front, acute beds, 2 or 3, and then maybe 7 or 8 beds down the aisle. There were medical interns and assistant residents, and surgical interns and assistant residents. And the medical chief resident was the attending physician. Every day I would walk through the emergency room, always once, often twice, just to see what's going on. I reviewed the charts of every patient from the day before, just making sure that things didn't slip under observation. So in the course of the year, there might have been 6 or 8 times that I'd have to call a resident and say, you know, you did a fine job with that patient who came in with the nosebleed yesterday, did the appropriate things. But next time you might want to wait for the platelet count to come back. It came back as 5,000. I think we should call him back, that type of thing. Fortunately, no one was hurt. But in the course of the year, there were 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of those types of things that happened. We arranged the conferences, we ran the clerkship, we ran the sub-internship, we ran residence report. When I was on the red service, the ward service, I worked up myself every patient who came in. I didn't do the complete H&P, but I knew what was going on. So I did a directed H&P in every patient admitted to the medical service. And I had a notebook. I kept a log of it. And I had one of those stamps, I forget what they call it, with the patient's name and number. And I put it in my book and the date they came in and the room they were assigned to, and who the resident was, what the chief complaint was, a little summary of what was going on and what was found and what was done. And I rounded regularly with each team, once a week, with each team on the service to go over their patients from the previous week. So I had follow-ups to all of these. I have subsequently donated that to the medical library, so it's in the archives now. I met individually with each intern and resident on inpatient medicine that I was working with. So for 6 months, it was the red interns. For 6 months, it was the blue interns. I met with them in my office, which is right down the hall from Dave Kipnis's office. Each week, I said, we're going to talk about something. And I said, there's one rule. You cannot tell me in advance what you would like to talk about. So they'd come into my office, and this is pre-digital, so my library was there in the office, all the reprints and tear outs and so forth. So we talk about whatever they wanted to talk about, and I had a reference that I gave them. I had to keep a library list to make sure I got the papers back. I think I lost 4 that year, but I met with each intern and resident doing that. Living in the Central West End and being single at the time and loving being in the hospital, I was regularly present in the evenings, just kind of hanging out. Sometimes there were medical things to do or to look after. Sometimes you're just shooting the breeze with the residents and a slow night. And, how's your wife doing? That sort of thing. But the house staff called me regularly for consultation. If they had a disagreement with a different service or with a subspecialty consultation for medicine, they would regularly consult me to help resolve it. Not that I was the gold standard, but I was called, scores of times during the year in that capacity. About 80% of the time, I agreed with the house staff. About 20% of the time with the perspective of the consultant. And the biggest reason was that the house staff, the residents were doing their job and looking at the whole patient and recognizing that the view of a particular subspecialty or consultant might miss the forest from the trees. So usually the disagreements were because of that. I wasn't perfect. I remember one case in particular when my opinion proved to be incorrect, and the surgeon's opinion proved to be correct. No harm was done, but I was frequently called in that capacity and found myself agreeing with house staff about 80% of the time. And usually my consultation was proven correct, but with the course of time. And of course, we saw Dave Kenneth a lot, which really meant a lot, both professionally as well as personally. So, it was just a great time. I loved that year.
So, it sounds like you had a lot of patient responsibility, but if I'm interpreting correctly, no direct patient care responsibility. That is to say that you didn't write extensive notes on every patient in the chart or bill for your services. Is that correct?
That is correct.
As opposed to what chief residents frequently do today, they function as kind of, de facto attending physicians for.
That's much later development.
Yeah.
In fact, seeing the patients as I did was not part of the job description. It's just something I wanted to do. Sure. It was fun, and I figured I'd learn something, maybe could teach something along the way. I didn't have to do that, but to your larger point, there were no direct patient care responsibilities for the chief resident and no billing of our services.
So, you mentioned your fellowship, and I believe your fellowship was somewhat unusual. Maybe you could say a few words about how you and Dr. Kipnis arranged that and what it consisted of.
Well, it was September, October, thereabouts, during my what we then called SAR year, now we call it PGY3. I was losing sleep, if you can imagine a resident losing sleep, because I was the only person in my cohort who did not have a fellowship or a job for the following July. At the time I was chief resident at the VA, I was literally the first WashU PGY3 to be chief resident at the VA. We did it for 6 months at that time. Lou Chase instituted the program. I did it the first 6 months, Al Jaffe the second 6 months. So I'm out at the VA and having fun. That rotation is going well, but losing sleep. And I'd gotten to know Dave pretty well as intern and assistant resident. He was pleased with how I was doing it as chief resident at the VA. And he read my book on the eugenics movement, my first book, and thought it was a very solid piece of work. So I went in to see him one day, and I said, Dr. Kipnis, do you think you might have a job for me next year working in clinic, something of that sort? And as you know, Dan, he has this way of saying things in an offhand manner that can either elevate you or deflate you. So he said, Ken, it always makes my day when someone that I like so much and respect so much indicates a desire to stay here. I'm already floated. But then he said, but you don't really want to be working in clinic, do you? He said, no, sir, not really. Well, what would you like to do? I'd like to have a self-designed fellowship in general internal medicine, in which I attend the wards at the VA 3 months a year to keep my clinical skills sharp, and go back to Harvard for 2 academic years of postgraduate work in the history of science and sharpen my historical skills, and find a new book project in preparation for an academic career in the Department of Medicine, when I have the same clinical and teaching responsibilities as other full-time faculty, but that the work that I do in this area counts as my scholarship. But he said, well, that's exactly what I'd hoped you would say. Why don't you plan yourself a fellowship that would allow you to do it? And I made some calls. I'm getting the chronology a little out of order. I think I called Harvard after that, but I worked it out and he paid for it. He said, Ken, that sounds terrific. You'll be a fellow of the Department of Medicine while you're back at Harvard as a research fellow there. I'll pay you $15,000 a year and $16,000 the second, $15,000 the first year and $16,000 the second year. And I felt rich. So it tells you how long ago that was. And you've done a great job here clinically. I'd like to offer you the chief residency and the completion of the fellowship. And after that, to be followed by a tenure track assistant professorship in the department with the full clinical and teaching responsibilities that you described, but your research will be your educational and historical work. And you've persuaded me, you have taught me that in your area, a book means something different than in science. So it's publish or perish for you, as it is for the rest of us. You want to get promoted, you're going to have to write another book and make it a good book. So in a short period of time, I went from not knowing what I do the following July to having this extraordinary opportunity presented to me. And as you know, Dan, that's vintage Dave Kipnis. And what made him so effective, and I think among the reasons he was a great man, was that he did this for lots of people. It wasn't just me. And you don't see it as much for people following conventional paths, except when you see people who might be lured to another institution, suddenly they get 3 times the lab space that Dave Kipnis made possible. But you see it also even more starkly, I think, in people who had unusual career interests. Dave supported them. So he supported Mark Frizzy, who brought informatics to WashU. He supported Mark Hammerman, who became chief of renal, despite not having a renal fellowship. His fellowship was in endocrine. He supported Jeff Gordon and made his work in the microbiome possible, and defended Jeff against a very angry and malicious Phil Majerus, who was very angry at Jeff because he went into GI rather than hematology. That's a story of itself. He did this for Auburn Morrison and made his career possible and linked him up with Phil Needleman. So Dave did this quite a bit for quite a few people in many different ways. His philosophy was always that the limiting factor in a person's work should be the ability and dedication and determination of that individual, not the conditions of work. And he saw his responsibility as identifying the right people and giving them conditions of work that were as close to perfect as possible. And he did that throughout his career.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you a little bit about this, but you've answered most of it. I would say that Eugene Stead, who of course helped train Dave, and Don Selden and Dave all had a characteristic which is unusual but crucial, and that is that they could both, they all of them could identify young people and see their career trajectory. They could predict their
Yes.
potential and their abilities, and then linking with that, again, I think in all three cases for those men, was that they would then work to provide the resources necessary to make what they predicted take place. I may have mentioned to you this. I think that, you know, given your particular interests and so on, I think the two places that would have been most conducive to your career success as it occurred were here in Hopkins. I think there are very few other places in the United States that would have, where it would have been as easy,
You
or
know,
as likely for you to do what you've done.
well, what I've done for me, WashU surpassed Johns Hopkins, and Dave Kipnis surpassed Victor McCusick. During my career, I've seen Hopkins in medicine, and as well as in other areas, lose outstanding people by failure to take that last step. And that's exactly what happened to me. And that's when I realized that Dave Kipnis had really taught me something important. Is when he made this offer to me, I'm maybe less than two and a half years out of medical school. I really enjoyed Hopkins, lots of friends. Most of the people I knew were still there. My teachers and mentors were still there. And I was very close to Victor McCusick. And Victor McCusick, for listeners who may not know the name, was their quote unquote giant. He was a foundational figure in human genetics. At the time, he was the chief of the Moore Clinic, the Human Genetics and Medical Genetics Division at Johns Hopkins. But after I came here to Washington University, he became chair of medicine at Johns Hopkins. And he was a profoundly important figure, one of the names that all medical students at the time knew, charismatic himself. And I was very close to Victor McCusick. It was our mutual interest in genetics that allowed that relationship to develop. But he was one of my mentors. One of the most extraordinary experiences in my life is that when I was writing my book, his door was always open to me. I did not need an appointment to see him. I could come by and talk with him literally anytime I wished without an appointment, and his door was always open. I never abused it. And I always knew when the meeting was over, but his door was continually open to me. And he read my book in manuscript and was the referee for the Johns Hopkins Press, and wrote a very powerful letter of recommendation in my internship application. So when Dave made the offer to me, I figured before I accepted and had all the details worked out, I called Victor. He's my mentor. Maybe I should discuss it with him. And I told him what was happening here. And I said, is there any possibility of that happening at Johns Hopkins? And he said, I really like this idea. Let me look into it. I'll get back to you. So he calls me a couple of days later. And he said, Ken, I'd like to offer you the same fellowship at Johns Hopkins. The only difference is that given our strengths in the history of medicine, you won't have to go back and forth between Boston and Baltimore. You'll be here the whole time, but I'd like to offer you the same fellowship. I said, gee, Dr. McCusick, that really sounds great. Let me ask you one other question. What would be the possibility of a faculty appointment on completion of this fellowship? And I remember to this day, his words, the timbre in his voice and so forth. He said, Ken, there's no question in my mind that when you complete this fellowship, you'll be a quote unquote, highly sellable commodity. But I'm not in a position to offer you a faculty position at this time or to talk about it at this time. I said, okay, thanks. And I realized that Dave had taught me something because he took that extra step.
I agree with you. I think examples in mentorship matter. Dave told me this story one time. He probably told you as well, that, when he was a senior resident with Gene Stead at Duke, you had to go to grand rounds at 8 o'clock on Friday morning or you were in great trouble. but it turned out there was a biochemistry seminar that met at the same time. So he went to see Dr. Stead and said, you know, Dr. Stead, I understand that it's important to go to grand rounds, but there's this really important biochemistry seminar I'd like to attend that is in conflict with it. And, you know, Stead stroked his chin and said, well, I guess that's all right on one condition. When you get done with that seminar, you come back here and have coffee with me and tell me what you learned each week. And if you'll do that, you can go to that seminar. And so, you know, that's, I think, you know, I mean, individualizing, you know, what's necessary for the career development of each person, I think, is one of the characteristics they share. So I finish up, I think, a little bit with, you know, talking about your own contributions to history of medical education. And of course, you've written the 3 books subsequent to your eugenics books, you know, Learning to Heal, Time to Heal, and Let Me Heal. Could you maybe talk a little bit about, you know, what you think is the sum of your contribution in those areas and what you've learned and what you think and what you would hope that we would take away and how that would influence American medicine going forward?
Well, collectively, the 3 books provide a panoramic account of the total development of medical education in the United States, including the teaching hospitals, graduate medical education, all dimensions of it. I think the greatest importance of the book is that they identify the core values and educational principles that need to be, that are constant, that are perpetual, even as all the specifics and surrounding things change. And by paying attention to the core principles, we have, I think, an opportunity to better deal with the challenges that are always there. Each generation has them, and to make things better going forward. And I would especially emphasize the importance of that medical education be professional education, university level professional education, and resist the pressures on it to devolve into vocational training. The importance of the medical institutions, the teaching hospital and a medical school remaining as public trusts, and always putting the patient first as the core value of medicine. Those, I think, are the core things that should be central to any decisions we make about anything coming up now or in the future.
All right. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to do this interview. I'm grateful to you for doing this. I'm sure that the people that see it will be grateful as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I'm honored. Thank you, Dan.